Hey guys, tonight, we begin with something a little quieter and perhaps a little stranger. Not with a battle or a king, or some unfortunate medieval person discovering that dentistry is mostly a matter of courage. Tonight, there is only an old piece of parchment, a few fading lines of ink, and a mystery that has managed to survive for centuries. So if these slow journeys into the past help you relax, feel free to subscribe or leave a comment telling us where in the world you are listening from tonight. Now dim the lights, get comfortable, and allow the room around you to become still. Our story begins beside the waters of the Bosporus in the early 16th century. Constantinople is no longer Constantinople, at least not officially. More than half a century has passed since the old Byzantine capital fell to the Ottoman armies. The great city is now the beating heart of an expanding empire, though people continue to call it by several names. Istanbul is heard increasingly in ordinary speech. Ottoman officials may call it Constantiniye. European merchants still speak of Constantinople. Names, like maps, have a habit of refusing to change all at once. The city spreads along hills overlooking dark blue water. Wooden houses lean into narrow streets. Dogs wander between market stalls. Ships crowd the harbour, their masts forming a thin forest against the pale morning sky. There is the smell of charcoal smoke, salt water, fish, leather, warm bread, and humanity. And somewhere within this enormous city, a sailor is drawing the world. His name is Piri. History remembers him as Piri Reis. Reis is not really a surname. It is a title, meaning captain or admiral. He is a sailor before he is a mapmaker, and that distinction matters. Piri does not sit in some quiet monastery copying geography from ancient books while rain falls outside. He has spent much of his life at sea. He knows what a coastline looks like when approached from the deck of a ship. He knows the anxiety of shallow water, the sudden appearance of rocks, and the relief of recognizing a familiar harbor after days of uncertain sailing. He has sailed through the Mediterranean alongside his uncle, Piri Reis, one of the most experienced Ottoman commanders of his age. Together they have known islands, storms, battles, ports, merchants, prisoners, rumors, and charts, especially charts. For a sailor in this period, a good map is not decoration. It can be survival. The Mediterranean world has already developed remarkably detailed sailing charts known as portolan charts. They show coastlines, harbors, islands, and networks of lines indicating sailing directions. They are practical objects. A chart might be rolled, folded, carried aboard a ship, stained by damp fingers, marked with notes, copied, traded, captured, inherited, or lost. And Piri is interested in all of them. By the year 1513, he has begun assembling something ambitious, a map of the world, or at least a portion of it. The parchment that survives today is only a fragment. The original map was larger, but much of it has disappeared. What remains is enough to make Piri famous centuries after his death. He works on gazelle skin, carefully preparing the surface. Across it, he draws coastlines in dark ink. He adds islands and rivers, he paints ships. Strange animals appear inland, notes fill empty spaces. The map is not clean in the modern sense. It is crowded alive. A modern map often tries to disappear behind its information. Piri's map does the opposite. It feels almost like a conversation between sailors. Here is a coast, here is an island, here is something somebody claimed to have seen, here is a story heard in a harbor. Here is a place where caution might be wise. And here, perhaps, is the edge of what anyone actually knows. Piri is working during one of the most dramatic changes in geographical knowledge that humanity has ever experienced. Only a little more than 2 decades have passed since Christopher Columbus crossed the Atlantic and reached islands in the Caribbean. Portuguese sailors have moved around Africa and into the Indian Ocean. European ships are pushing into waters that their own geographical traditions had represented poorly, if at all. The world has not suddenly become larger. People are simply realizing how much of it their maps have failed to describe. Imagine the uncertainty. Today, a person can look at a globe and recognize the familiar shapes of continents almost without thinking. Africa narrows toward the south. South America curves outward and then tapers. India points into the Indian Ocean. Australia sits below Southeast Asia. Antarctica circles the bottom of the planet. These shapes feel permanent, obvious, but for Piri Reis, they are not obvious at all. The coastline of the Americas is still being assembled from separate voyages. Sailors return with observations. Cartographers compare them. Copies are made. Errors travel alongside accurate information. One captain says the coast continues south. Another claims an island lies beyond it. A third has measurements. A fourth has only a story. Peary gathers what he can, and this is where the mystery begins, on the surviving map. He leaves notes explaining something about his sources. He says that he has consulted around 20 charts and maps. Some are Portuguese. One is associated with Columbus. Others, he claims, descend from much older geographical traditions. It is an extraordinary little library of information compressed onto one sheet of parchment. The map shows the western coasts of Europe and Africa. Across the Atlantic, it shows parts of the newly encountered lands. The coast of Brazil is particularly recognizable. There are islands in the Atlantic, there are drawings of ships, and then the coastline continues south. It bends, it stretches eastward. And centuries later, people begin looking at this southern portion and asking a remarkable question. Is that Antarctica? The question sounds almost absurd. Antarctica is not generally recognized by European explorers until centuries after Peary creates his map. And even more strangely, some later writers will argue that the coastline on Peary's parchment resembles Antarctica, not as it appears beneath mountains of ice today, but as the underlying land might appear without that ice. A map made in 1513 showing an ice-free Antarctica. It is the sort of claim that immediately pulls the imagination into deep water. If Peary copied older maps, where did those maps come from? Who could have surveyed Antarctica? When and how? Some theories will eventually travel thousands of years into the past. They will speak of forgotten civilizations, vanished navigators, ancient geographical knowledge preserved through lost archives. Others will go further still. But before wandering into those colder and stranger possibilities, it is worth remaining beside Peary for a while, because the real man is interesting enough. He lives in a world where information moves in unexpected ways. Ships are captured in war. Charts change hands. Sailors from rival kingdoms meet in ports. Prisoners are questioned. Merchants carry stories across borders. A Portuguese map might reach an Ottoman captain not because the Portuguese government wants him to see it, but because someone has taken it from a captured vessel. Knowledge leaks. It always has. And Piri is unusually good at collecting the drops. His surviving notes reveal a man trying to explain his work rather than hide it. He does not claim that he personally sailed along every coast shown on the parchment. He admits that the map is compiled. That is important. He is not saying, I saw all of this. He is saying, in effect, I gathered what others knew. That is what makes the southern coastline so fascinating. If it truly contains knowledge of Antarctica, then the mystery does not begin with Peary. It begins with his sources, perhaps with the sources behind those sources, a chain of copying disappearing backward through time. It is easy to imagine that chain romantically, a weathered chart in an Ottoman harbour, before that a Portuguese ship, before that a library somewhere in Europe, before that perhaps an Arabic geographer, before that a Byzantine manuscript, before that Alexandria, before that the imagination can continue almost indefinitely. But history rarely gives such tidy chains. Documents burn, ships sink, libraries scatter. People copy mistakes as faithfully as they copy truths. And maps are especially dangerous objects from which to build fantasies, because old cartographers often draw things they have never seen. A blank space troubles the human mind, so people fill it, sometimes with monsters, sometimes with mountains, sometimes with continents. The ancient Greeks had already imagined that a great southern land might exist. Their reasoning was not based on anyone visiting Antarctica. It came partly from ideas about balance. If there were great masses of land in the north, perhaps land should exist in the south as well. Centuries later, this hypothetical region becomes known in European geographical tradition as Terra Australis Incognita, the unknown southern land. It appears on maps long before anyone has confirmed what is actually there. And so when a strange southern coastline appears on an old chart, caution is necessary. A coastline can look convincing without representing a surveyed place. Piri's map presents another problem. The farther south one follows the coast of South America, the stranger its orientation becomes. Instead of continuing downward in the way familiar from a modern atlas, the land curves eastward. To someone searching for Antarctica, this curve is irresistible. South America seems to become another continent. But there is a simpler possibility. Piri may simply have bent the South American coastline. Early cartographers frequently struggled with scale, projection, incomplete reports, and the challenge of fitting enormous regions onto limited pieces of parchment. He may have had information suggesting that the Brazilian coast continued much farther south, but lacked accurate measurements for its shape, and so it bends. Not because an ancient civilization surveyed Antarctica, but because a 16th century mapmaker is trying to fit uncertain geography onto gazelle skin. There is something almost comforting about that possibility. A mystery born not from impossible knowledge, but from an ordinary human problem. There is not enough room. The information is incomplete, the sources disagree, and the mapmaker must still draw something. Outside, Constantinople continues around him. A call to prayer carries over rooftops. Oars strike the Bosporus. A merchant argues over cloth. Somewhere, a ship prepares to sail toward Alexandria. Another may be arriving from the western Mediterranean, carrying news from lands Piri has never seen. The map slowly fills. Brazil takes shape in ink. Africa watches from across the Atlantic. Unknown coastlines wait at the edge. Piri cannot know that more than 4 centuries later, his parchment will be rediscovered in an imperial palace. He cannot know that scholars, amateur historians, naval officers and writers will lean over reproductions of his work. He cannot know that people will see Antarctica in those fading lines. For him, this is not an ancient mystery. It is current geography, messy, incomplete, changing geography. And perhaps that is the first quiet lesson of the Piri Reis Map. The past did not know that it was mysterious. It was simply trying to understand the world with whatever scraps of information happened to survive. Piri lays down another line of ink. Somewhere beyond that line is a coast he has never visited. Beyond that coast is an ocean. And beyond the ocean, farther south than almost any sailor of his world can imagine, lies a continent covered in ice. Whether his map truly knows anything about that continent is another question entirely. And it is there, in the narrow space between what the parchment shows and what later generations desperately want it to show, that the mystery becomes much deeper. The southern edge of the parchment waits quietly. There are no trumpets here, no inscription announcing that a lost continent has been discovered, no confident declaration that an ancient navigator once crossed the freezing seas at the bottom of the world. There is only a coastline. And sometimes, a coastline is enough to keep a mystery alive for centuries. To understand why this particular line becomes so famous, it helps to leave the warm waters around Constantinople and travel south in the imagination, far south, past the Mediterranean, past the coast of Africa, past the latitudes familiar to most sailors of Piri Reis's lifetime. Eventually the air grows colder, the sea darkens, wind moves over an immense wilderness of water. Then, beyond the grey horizon, there is white. Antarctica. Today, the continent is almost completely buried beneath ice. In places, that ice reaches several kilometers in thickness. Mountain ranges disappear beneath it. Valleys lie hidden. Ancient river systems remain sealed away under a frozen surface. The landscape visible from above is therefore not quite the landscape of the continent itself. It is a continent wearing a mask of ice. This distinction becomes central to the strange reputation of Piri's map. Centuries after the Ottoman admiral puts down his pen, researchers begin comparing the mysterious southern coastline on his parchment with modern maps. Some see nothing extraordinary. They see a distorted continuation of South America. Others see something astonishing. They believe the coastline resembles part of Antarctica. More precisely, they argue that it resembles the land beneath the Antarctic ice. That small difference transforms an interesting cartographic puzzle into something much larger. If the map merely shows Antarctica, it would still seem remarkably early. But if it shows Antarctica without ice, then whoever originally surveyed the coastline must, according to the theory, have seen the continent under conditions very different from those of the modern world. The question becomes uncomfortable. How old would such a map have to be? The answer offered by some writers is not centuries. It is thousands of years. And so the quiet parchment begins attracting theories of civilizations that history has forgotten. The most influential version of the idea emerges in the 20th century. A scholar named Charles Hapgood becomes fascinated by old maps. He believes that some surviving charts may preserve geographical information inherited from an unknown ancient culture. According to this theory, sailors living thousands of years before the familiar civilizations of Greece and Rome might have explored much of the globe. Their original maps vanished, but copies survived. Those copies were copied again. Fragments passed through Egyptian, Greek, Roman, Byzantine, Arab, Portuguese, and other hands. Eventually, tiny pieces of this ancient geographical inheritance reached mapmakers such as Piri Reis. It is a beautiful theory that does not make it correct. But it is easy to understand why people find it attractive. History is full of lost documents. The ancient world produced enormous amounts of writing that no longer survive. Libraries burned, papyrus decayed, parchment was scraped clean and reused. Wars scattered archives. Ships carrying manuscripts sank without leaving so much as a title behind. Anyone who studies the ancient world becomes accustomed to absence. Sometimes an entire work is known only because another writer mentions it. Sometimes generations of knowledge survive in a handful of fragments. So the idea of lost maps is not foolish by itself. Lost maps certainly existed. The difficult question is what they showed. Could ancient sailors have mapped coastlines far beyond the regions usually associated with them? Possibly in some cases. Sailors are adventurous people, especially when trade, fishing, war, or simple bad weather pushes them beyond familiar waters. But Antarctica presents a different challenge. Even if an ancient ship somehow reached the far south, the coast would not have been conveniently free of ice during any period remotely close to the rise of known human civilization. The Antarctic ice sheet is vastly older. This creates a serious problem for the idea that an advanced civilization merely sailed there several thousand years ago and mapped exposed coastlines. The ice does not cooperate with the story. Nor does the parchment itself. When historians examine Piri's map in the context of early 16th century cartography, many of its strange features begin to look less impossible. Maps from this period are not modern satellite images drawn badly. They belong to a different tradition. Distances can stretch, directions can shift, separate reports can be joined incorrectly, islands can appear more than once. A coast observed in fragments can become a continuous line through the mapmaker's judgment. The farther a place lies from familiar sailing routes, the greater the uncertainty often becomes. South America is a perfect example. When Piri makes his map, Europeans have only recently begun exploring its enormous Atlantic coastline. Brazil has been encountered, but the southern limits of the continent remain imperfectly understood. Reports arrive slowly, measurements vary, longitude especially remains extremely difficult to determine accurately at sea. Latitude can be estimated by observing the sky. Longitude is another matter. Without a reliable way to compare local time with the time at a fixed reference point, determining east-west position is difficult. A coastline can therefore be reasonably recognizable in pieces while still becoming strangely distorted when those pieces are assembled. Piri is working with precisely this kind of puzzle. Imagine a table covered with charts. One Portuguese chart shows part of Brazil, another gives islands in the Atlantic. A captured map contains information from a different voyage. A sailor describes a coast from memory. Another source gives distances measured in days of sailing. The scales do not match. The orientations are slightly different. Place names vary. Some information is reliable, some is rumor. And all of it must become one map. The mystery begins to look less like impossible knowledge and more like an exhausted cartographer trying to make several imperfect witnesses agree. There is also the problem of projection. The Earth is round, parchment is flat. Every flat world map, therefore, has to distort something. Shape, distance, direction, or area must bend in some way. Modern mapmakers use mathematical projections and openly accept particular distortions. Early mapmakers had their own systems, traditions, and compromises. Piri's surviving map includes networks of directional lines inherited from Portolan chart traditions. These work beautifully for navigation across certain seas. They do not magically solve the problem of representing an entire globe. The strange southern coastline may therefore owe part of its appearance to the process of fitting geographical information into the map structure. There is another detail that is easy to forget. People often look at old maps with modern coastlines already fixed in their minds. The eye searches for familiar shapes. A curve becomes a peninsula. A bay becomes another bay. A distorted line begins to resemble something seen on a modern atlas. Human beings are remarkably good at finding patterns. Sometimes too good. Clouds become faces, stars become hunters and bears, and uncertain coastlines become Antarctica. None of this means that the Piri Reis map is ordinary. Quite the opposite. Its real importance may be more fascinating than the myth surrounding it. It captures a moment when different traditions of geographical knowledge are colliding. The Mediterranean world meets the Atlantic. Old maps meet new voyages. Ottoman sailors absorb information from European exploration. Stories from Columbus's expeditions mingle with Portuguese discoveries and older cartographic traditions. The parchment becomes a meeting place, a tiny archive. A world assembled from worlds, and then it disappears. For centuries, Piri's map is largely forgotten. The Ottoman Empire continues. Sultans rise and die, ships change, borders move. The age of sail slowly gives way to steam. The world becomes increasingly well mapped. Antarctica itself is eventually approached and observed by explorers. Its coastlines are charted. Its interior remains mysterious for much longer. Then, in the early 20th century, scholars working in Istanbul discover the surviving fragment of Piri's map in the collections of the old imperial palace. Imagine that moment, a piece of gazelle skin, centuries old, faded colors, strange animals. Ships floating across painted seas, notes written by an Ottoman admiral who has been dead for generations, and there along the bottom, the troublesome coast still waits. The modern world is now capable of looking at it differently. People know Antarctica exists. They possess accurate maps of South America. They can compare. They can speculate. The mystery is no longer simply what Piri drew. It is what modern observers bring with them when they look. That may be the quiet twist hidden inside the entire story. The map has not changed. The viewers have. In Piri's lifetime, the southern line may have represented uncertain geography at the edge of Portuguese exploration. To a 20th century reader, it can become evidence of a forgotten civilization. To another scholar, it is simply a cartographic distortion. To someone lying awake late at night, listening to an old story while rain touches the window, it might become something else again, a reminder of how much knowledge disappears, and how tempting it is to place extraordinary things inside the empty spaces. The parchment offers no final answer. Piri himself cannot return to explain every curve. The charts he consulted are mostly gone. The sailors who supplied their information have vanished with their ships, their arguments, their memories, and their mistakes. All that remains is the map, and perhaps this is why it continues to fascinate. Not because it proves that someone mapped Antarctica without ice. There is no solid evidence that it does, but because it allows a more haunting possibility to linger at the edge of thought. Every map is made from earlier knowledge. Every mapmaker inherits something, a measurement, a rumor, a copied coastline, a sailor's memory, and when the original sources disappear, certainty disappears with them. The line at the bottom of Piri's parchment remains silent. It may be nothing more than South America bent eastward by imperfect information and the limits of the mapmaker's craft. Yet behind that simple explanation waits another question. If Piri really used around 20 older charts, what became of them? What did they contain? And how old were the oldest among them? The answers have been lost somewhere between harbors, libraries, wars, and centuries, so the mystery does not need an ice-free Antarctica to survive. It only needs a missing map. And Piri Reis had many. Let us leave the faded parchment for a moment and follow those missing charts backward, away from the Ottoman palace and toward the crowded docks of the Mediterranean. There, among captured ships, Portuguese navigators, Genoese merchants, and sailors returning from the Atlantic, another story is beginning. It is the story of the maps behind the map. And somewhere among them is said to have been a chart connected to a sailor whose voyage changed the geography of the world. Christopher Columbus. Let us leave the faded parchment behind and follow the older charts into the salt-stained world from which they came. The trail does not lead into a quiet library. It leads toward ships, toward crowded docks and damp warehouses, toward sailors sleeping beneath patched canvas, toward merchants arguing beside barrels of wine and olive oil. It leads across the Mediterranean, where knowledge rarely travels in a straight line. In the late 15th and early 16th centuries, a map can move through the world in many ways. It can be purchased, it can be copied, it can be given as a diplomatic gift, it can be stolen. And sometimes, it can be taken from a ship whose crew has just lost a battle. Piri Reis understands this world well. Long before he becomes remembered as the creator of a mysterious map, he sails with his uncle, Kamal Reis. Kamal is an experienced Ottoman seaman. He operates in the Mediterranean during a period when the sea is crowded with competing powers. Ottoman vessels sail alongside merchant ships from Venice and Genoa. Spanish and Portuguese ships appear in Western waters. North African ports connect trade routes stretching toward the Sahara and beyond. The Mediterranean may look small on a modern globe. For the people living around it, however, it is an entire world. A person can leave Alexandria carrying pepper and cloth, pass Crete, hear Greek spoken in one harbour, Italian in another, Arabic farther south, and eventually arrive near the Western Mediterranean with stories gathered from half a dozen cultures. Maps travel with these people, and maps are valuable. A useful chart contains experience that someone else has already paid for, perhaps paid for with money, perhaps with years, perhaps with a shipwreck. A mark showing shallow water may represent a vessel that once struck the bottom. A carefully drawn island may preserve the observations of generations of pilots. A harbour entrance marked between two dangerous rocks can be worth more to a captain than a beautiful painting. Knowledge at sea has weight. Piri collects it. His later writings suggest that he understands cartography not as a purely scholarly exercise, but as something tied directly to navigation. This is one reason his claim about using older maps deserves attention. He is not inventing the idea that mapmakers copy earlier sources. They do. Almost every map contains something inherited. Even modern maps depend upon earlier surveys, measurements, observations, and corrections. The interesting part is identifying Piri's sources. And there, certainty begins to fade. In the notes written on his surviving world map, Piri describes using a collection of charts. Some, he says, are very old. Others come from more recent Portuguese discoveries. And one source is particularly intriguing. It is connected with Christopher Columbus. The name alone changes the atmosphere. Columbus has become so familiar in later history that it is easy to forget how strange his voyages must have seemed to people living during Piri's lifetime. When Columbus sails west across the Atlantic in the late 15th century, he does not believe he has discovered a new continent. He is attempting to reach Asia. His geography is wrong in ways that happen to produce one of history's most consequential voyages. He underestimates the distance that would need to be crossed to reach Asia by sailing west. Had the American continents not stood in the way, his expedition would have faced an ocean far larger than the one he expected. But land does stand in the way. Islands appear. People are already living there, of course, in societies with their own histories, stretching back thousands of years. To Europeans, however, the information is startling. News spreads, maps begin changing, and almost immediately the new geography becomes politically valuable. Spain and Portugal are competing for overseas routes, territories, and trade. Geographical knowledge is therefore not something governments necessarily wish to share freely. A chart showing newly explored coastlines can be a strategic object. A rival who knows where ships have sailed may follow. A rival who knows where harbors lie may arrive. Secrecy is imperfect, however. Sailors talk, maps are copied, ships are captured, information escapes. Piri claims that information connected to Columbus reaches his family through precisely this violent maritime world. According to an account associated with his map, an enslaved or captured sailor who had sailed with Columbus provided knowledge of the western lands. The exact details remain debated, but the broader possibility is entirely believable. Crews from captured ships could carry geographical knowledge with them. A sailor does not need to possess a perfect chart to remember something useful. He may remember that an island lies several days west of another. He may remember the shape of a bay. He may remember which direction a coastline runs. He may know what Columbus believed he had found. And memory, when combined with charts, becomes another source. Picture Piri listening. The room is dim. Perhaps there is a lamp burning oil. Outside, ropes knock softly against wooden masts. A sailor speaks of an ocean wider than the Mediterranean, of islands covered with unfamiliar plants, of people whose languages sound unlike anything heard in European ports, of coastlines that seem to continue forever. Piri does not need to believe every word. A good navigator learns quickly that sailors exaggerate. A fish becomes larger with every telling. A storm becomes more violent. An island becomes richer. A distant coast becomes stranger. But beneath the exaggeration there can be valuable details. Piri gathers them. This makes his map a kind of historical conversation. Columbus may be present indirectly. Portuguese navigators are present. Older Mediterranean cartographers are present. Possibly Arabic geographical traditions are present. Perhaps information ultimately descending from classical sources is present too. Yet this does not mean every old source is equally ancient. The phrase ancient map can be misleading. To a person living in the early 16th century, a chart made a few centuries earlier can already seem extremely old. It does not have to come from a civilization lost before recorded history. A map can be old without being mysterious. Still, some of Piri's references have encouraged speculation. He mentions maps associated with the age of Alexander. Alexander the Great lived many centuries before Piri. If taken literally, this sounds extraordinary, but historical mapmakers often connect geographical traditions with famous ancient authorities. A map described as coming from the time of Alexander does not necessarily mean Piri is holding an original parchment carried by one of Alexander's generals. It may mean that some information is believed to descend from ancient geographical works. This distinction is important. Copies have families. A manuscript can descend from another manuscript that descends from another. Errors pass down the family line, so do corrections. Imagine copying a coastline by hand. The original line is slightly curved. Your copy bends it a little more. Another person copies yours. A small bay becomes larger. A cape moves. After several generations, the coastline still resembles the original, but it is no longer identical. This is normal. And before printing becomes widespread, copying by hand is one of the main ways geographical information survives. The ancient Mediterranean world had produced sophisticated geographical thought. Greek scholars understood that the Earth was spherical long before Piri's lifetime. They estimated its size. They developed systems using latitude and longitude. One of the most famous figures in this tradition is Claudius Ptolemy, who worked in the ancient city of Alexandria during the Roman period. Ptolemy's geographical writings survive through manuscripts and later become enormously influential. His world is not our world. His maps contain major errors. But the method matters. Places can be described using coordinates. Geography can become mathematical. Centuries pass. Political empires change. Languages change. The knowledge does not simply vanish. Greek works are preserved, translated, studied, corrected, forgotten in some regions, remembered in others, and eventually rediscovered in new contexts. Scholars writing in Arabic make major contributions to geography and astronomy. Travelers describe distant regions. Merchants connect seas. Pilots accumulate practical knowledge that scholarly texts may never record. By Piri's age, these traditions overlap. This is more interesting than the idea of one secret civilization handing down a perfect map. Real knowledge is messier. It moves sideways. A Greek calculation meets an Arab astronomer's correction. A Portuguese sailor's observation meets a Mediterranean chart. A merchant's rumor meets a captain's measurement. Then a mapmaker sits down and decides which version to trust. The result can look remarkably accurate in one place and wildly wrong in another. Piri's map does exactly that. Parts of the Atlantic geography are impressive. Other parts are confusing. Some islands appear where modern geography does not expect them. Animals decorate lands where the artist has never traveled. Stories and observations sit side by side. This unevenness is evidence of the map's real historical character. A perfect map of the entire globe would be difficult to explain. An imperfect map assembled from sources of varying quality is exactly what one might expect. And yet one missing object continues to tempt the imagination: the Columbus chart. If Piri truly had access to geographical material connected with Columbus, what did it look like? No original world map drawn personally by Columbus survives for comparison. His cartographic world has to be reconstructed from writings, later copies, associated charts, and the broader geographical ideas of his time. So once again there is an absence, a missing piece. Perhaps the chart Piri saw was ordinary. Perhaps it showed Caribbean islands and portions of nearby coastlines. Perhaps its information was already several generations removed from Columbus himself. Or perhaps Piri possessed something that would make historians deeply envious today. There is no way to place it back on the table. It is gone. This is the quieter sadness behind old maps. We tend to admire what survives. We rarely think about the thousands of objects that did not. Charts were working tools. They were exposed to salt, water, sunlight, insects, fire, careless hands. A beautiful map in a museum today may be treated like treasure. A sailor centuries ago might fold one beneath a wooden chest. The maps behind Piri's map could have disappeared without ceremony. One may have rotted aboard a ship, another may have burned in a harbour warehouse, another might have been cut apart because the parchment itself was useful. A chart connected to Columbus might have survived for decades and then vanished because one person did not understand what later centuries would pay to see it. History does not know which objects will become important. That knowledge comes afterward. Piri himself becomes part of this same pattern. His Great World Map is not preserved complete. Only a fragment survives. The missing portion might have answered questions that have occupied generations. Perhaps it would have made the southern coastline easier to interpret. Perhaps it would have created even more mysteries. We cannot know. The sea keeps many things, time keeps more. And somewhere between the Atlantic voyages of Columbus and the desk of an Ottoman admiral, information passes from hand to hand until its original shape becomes impossible to recover. That is the real labyrinth behind the famous parchment. Not a single forbidden map, but a family of lost charts, some recent, some old, some copied, some remembered, some probably wrong, and perhaps a few surprisingly accurate. We drift onward now, deeper into those forgotten roots, toward the Portuguese sailors who were quietly redrawing the edges of the known world. For while Columbus sailed west, another great geographical experiment had already been unfolding along the coast of Africa. And the maps created there would change not only what Piri Reis could draw, but what almost everyone around the Atlantic believed the world looked like. Along the western edge of Europe, another map is taking shape. Not on one piece of parchment, and not beneath the hand of one patient cartographer. It is being drawn slowly by ships. Portuguese vessels move southward along the coast of Africa, voyage after voyage, generation after generation. Each journey adds another cape, another river mouth, another island, another stretch of coastline to European geographical knowledge. The process is less dramatic than the old legends make it sound. There is rarely a single moment when an unknown world suddenly becomes known. Instead, sailors travel a little farther. Then someone travels farther still. A coastline that once ended at the edge of a chart gains another 100 miles. Then another. The blank space retreats. During the 15th century, Portuguese navigators gradually explore the Atlantic coast of Africa. Their motives are mixed: trade matters, gold matters, political power matters, religion matters. And, increasingly so does the brutal traffic in enslaved human beings that will become one of the darkest features of Atlantic history. Behind these voyages stands a growing culture of maritime knowledge. Pilots study winds and currents. Sailors learn the behavior of the Atlantic. Cartographers update charts. Astronomical observations help navigators estimate latitude. Knowledge becomes cumulative. One voyage remembers the last. This is the world whose information eventually reaches Piri Reis. And it is important because Portuguese charts are among the sources he specifically mentions. The Portuguese have good reasons to protect them. A useful map is an economic weapon. If a captain knows the safest route around a dangerous cape, he possesses something a rival may desperately want. If a government knows where profitable ports or islands lie, sharing that information may invite competition. So geographical knowledge can become secret. This secrecy later encourages romantic ideas about hidden archives filled with impossible maps. The reality is less theatrical, though still fascinating. Secrets leak. A sailor changes employers. A chart is copied. A ship is captured. A foreign merchant sees something he was not supposed to see. A mapmaker combines public information with private reports. No government has ever been entirely successful at preventing sailors from talking. And sailors have much to talk about. By the late 15th century, Portuguese voyagers have achieved something once enormously difficult. They have rounded the southern end of Africa. Bartolomeu Dias reaches the region around the Cape of Good Hope. A few years later, Vasco da Gama sails around Africa and continues toward India. The maritime geography of the known world changes. The Atlantic and Indian Oceans are not separate enclosed waters. A ship can sail from Europe around Africa and into the seas leading toward India. For merchants, rulers, and sailors, the implications are enormous. For mapmakers, there is a different problem. Everything must now fit on the page. Old assumptions have to move, coastlines need to stretch, distances must be reconsidered, and almost immediately, another geographical shock arrives from the west. Columbus has crossed the Atlantic. Then other voyages follow. The Portuguese reach the coast of Brazil. Now imagine being a cartographer during these decades. The world refuses to remain still. A map made when you are young may be badly outdated before you are old. New islands appear in reports. New coasts emerge. A peninsula may turn out to be part of a continent. A place believed to belong to Asia may belong to something else entirely. Even the people doing the exploring do not always understand what they have found. This uncertainty is essential when looking at Piri's southern coastline. Modern viewers already know the answer. They know where South America ends. They know where Antarctica begins. Piri does not. The sailors providing his information do not necessarily know either. The coast of Brazil extends southward for an enormous distance. Early voyagers explore parts of it, but observations are incomplete. And somewhere in this imperfect information, Piri must decide how to continue the line. He draws it south. Then he turns it east. That eastward turn becomes famous. Later readers place a modern map beside Piri's parchment and notice that Antarctica lies generally eastward beyond the southern tip of South America. The temptation is immediate. Perhaps they think the mapmaker has joined South America to Antarctica. Perhaps his ancient sources knew both, but there is another explanation hidden in the ordinary habits of old cartography. Mapmakers dislike unfinished coastlines. A line that simply stops can feel unresolved. When information is uncertain, the coast may be extended according to expectation. Sometimes hypothetical lands are joined to known ones. Sometimes unknown regions are compressed. Sometimes a coastline is bent simply because the parchment has an edge. Piri is not drawing with access to a modern globe. He is solving a visual puzzle with limited evidence. There may also be confusion involving the southern parts of South America themselves. European understanding of the region develops gradually. The famous voyage of Ferdinand Magellan, which passes through the strait bearing his name, begins only several years after Piri completes his surviving map. That matters. When Piri draws the southern Atlantic, Europeans have not yet established through Magellan's expedition the familiar relationship between the southern end of South America and the ocean beyond it. The geography remains unsettled. A strange southern coast is therefore not strange in the same way it would be on a map made centuries later. It belongs to a moment of uncertainty. This does not remove all mystery, but it changes its flavor. Instead of asking how Piri could possibly know about Antarctica, one can ask a more historically grounded question. What did Piri think the southern coast represented? Unfortunately, he does not leave a simple sentence saying exactly what later generations want to know. The map must speak through its shape, labels, illustrations, and context, and maps are not always cooperative witnesses. There are hints that the southern land belongs conceptually to the geography of South America rather than to a separate polar continent. The coastline flows continuously, there is no clear ocean gap announcing a different landmass. This supports the idea that Piri is extending the South American coast based on imperfect sources. There are also descriptions and illustrations associated with regions understood through contemporary voyage accounts. In other words, the map looks like a product of its own age. That may sound disappointing. A lost civilization surveying Antarctica thousands of years ago is a dramatic story. A 16th century sailor combining Portuguese charts incorrectly sounds smaller. But only at first, because the real achievement is extraordinary in a different way. Piri is working at the meeting point of civilizations. His map demonstrates how quickly geographical information can cross political and religious boundaries. Europe and the Ottoman Empire are rivals in many regions. They fight wars, they compete for influence. Yet knowledge refuses to remain inside neat borders. A Portuguese observation can appear on an Ottoman map. Information associated with Columbus can travel into a Muslim admiral's collection. Classical geographical ideas can survive through centuries of translation and copying. Maps become travelers even when their makers stay home. There is something almost gentle about that thought. A line drawn in Lisbon may be copied in the Mediterranean. A sailor from Spain may describe an island to someone who speaks another language. A chart captured during violence may later contribute to a work of scholarship. Knowledge carries the scars of the world that moves it, and sometimes those scars become visible as errors. Suppose Piri has several charts before him. One shows the African coast carefully, another contains Brazil. A third shows islands discovered farther west. They use different scales, their reference points differ. He begins fitting them together. Africa sits reasonably well, the Atlantic islands settle into place, the Brazilian coast runs southward. But there's too much coastline and not enough parchment. Or perhaps one source gives a direction that another contradicts. A decision has to be made. The line bends east. Centuries later, that bend becomes Antarctica. This is one of the strange pleasures of historical mysteries. A small decision made by one person can acquire a life far beyond anything intended. Piri may have spent only an afternoon deciding how to draw that part of the coast. Perhaps less. He might even have been dissatisfied with it. He could have looked at the line and thought that better information would eventually correct it. He could never imagine that people living centuries later would examine that same curve with rulers, projections, geological theories, and photographs of Antarctica. The mapmaker's uncertainty becomes the viewer's mystery. Yet another question remains. What about the claim that the coastline resembles Antarctica beneath the ice? This is more specific, and because it is more specific, it deserves closer attention. Antarctica is not merely a white circle at the bottom of the Earth. Beneath the ice lies complicated terrain. Mountain ranges rise under frozen sheets. Basins sink below sea level. Rocky coastlines exist beneath glaciers. Modern science has used seismic measurements, radar, gravity data, and other methods to reconstruct what lies below. The resulting landscape is fascinating, but comparing that hidden landscape with a hand-drawn 16th century map is not straightforward. One problem is that removing the ice would not simply reveal the modern underlying coastline exactly as it sits today. The enormous weight of Antarctic ice presses down on the crust. If the ice disappeared, the land would respond over time. Sea levels would change dramatically. Coastlines would shift. The continent would not simply become the same outline with the white covering erased. So even the phrase Antarctica without ice hides a complicated geological problem. There is also the question of resemblance. How close does one shape need to be before it counts as a match? With enough rotation, stretching, and interpretation, many irregular coastlines can be made to resemble one another. The human eye is generous when it wants a mystery to work. That does not mean every comparison is dishonest. It means comparisons need rules, otherwise the conclusion can quietly enter the evidence before the investigation has begun. Piri's map has survived long enough to become a mirror. People looking for evidence of lost civilizations can find suggestive shapes. Historians studying early modern navigation find Portuguese and Spanish geographical knowledge. Cartographers find projection problems. Sailors may simply admire another sailor trying to organize a changing world. Perhaps all old objects become mirrors eventually. They accumulate interpretations. The original maker grows silent. Everyone else begins speaking. Still, beneath all those voices, Antarctica remains. Real, remote, enormous, covered in ice. And the history of that ice is far older than Piri Reis, Columbus, Portugal, Rome, Greece, Egypt, or any civilization known to archaeology. This fact leads us toward the coldest part of the mystery. If the southern coast truly represents Antarctica without its frozen covering, then the story must reach backward into a world almost unimaginably distant from the Ottoman admiral, a world before cities, before farming, before written history. Perhaps even before anything we would recognize as human civilization. That is where the romantic theory begins to strain beneath its own weight, and that is where science enters the room. We drift onward, away from the warm docks of Lisbon and the crowded waters of the Mediterranean. The sails fade behind us. The air becomes thin and bitter. The sea turns dark beneath a pale sky. Ahead lies a continent that humans would struggle to approach for centuries, Antarctica. And beneath miles of ancient ice, the land keeps a history far older than any surviving map. We drift onward, deeper into the forgotten days, leaving the warm harbors of the Mediterranean far behind. The change is almost uncomfortable. Gone are the cries of merchants along the docks. Gone are the smells of olive oil, tar, smoke, and wet rope. Gone are the crowded wooden ships rocking gently beside stone quays. Ahead, there is only wind. It moves across an enormous white landscape, with almost nothing to stop it. Snow lifts from the surface in thin veils. Mountains rise in the distance, dark rock appearing briefly through the ice before disappearing again beneath cloud. This is Antarctica, and if the strange southern line on the Piri Reis map is going to become something more than an error of early cartography, then Antarctica itself must become a witness. Unfortunately for the mystery, the continent has a very long memory. The ice covering Antarctica is not a recent blanket. It did not appear a few thousand years before Piri Reis. It did not suddenly cover a green continent shortly after some forgotten fleet completed its survey. Its story reaches far deeper into geological time. Tens of millions of years ago, Antarctica was indeed very different. There were forests here. There were rivers. The continent once supported ecosystems that would seem impossible to anyone standing on the Antarctic ice today. Go back far enough, and Antarctica was connected to other parts of the ancient supercontinent Gondwana. The positions of continents were different. The climate was different. Plants grew at latitudes now associated with almost unimaginable cold. But continental drift is slow. Climate change across geological ages is slow. And the great transformation of Antarctica into a frozen world began long before human beings existed. By the time recognizable human ancestors were walking elsewhere on Earth, Antarctica had already been dominated by ice for an extraordinary span of time. This creates the central difficulty for the idea of an ancient civilization mapping an ice-free Antarctic coast. There is no known human civilization old enough to have seen Antarctica before its major ice sheets formed, not even close. The earliest cities belong to a world only several thousand years in the past. Agriculture is older, but still extremely recent when compared with Antarctic ice. Even the entire existence of modern humans occupies only a tiny moment beside the geological history of the frozen continent. The timelines simply do not meet. Yet the mystery does not disappear immediately. Supporters of the ice-free interpretation have sometimes proposed a softer version, perhaps. They suggest the map does not require the whole continent to have been free of ice. Maybe only parts of the coastline were exposed. Perhaps climatic conditions changed. Perhaps an ancient survey captured a coastal region before later ice expansion covered it. This sounds more plausible at first. Climate does change. Glaciers advance and retreat. Ice shelves grow and break apart. Antarctica is not perfectly frozen in exactly the same way forever, but the question remains one of scale. Could a coastline resembling the one imagined on the Piri Reis Map have been exposed during the age of human civilization? Evidence does not support the dramatic version of that idea. The Antarctic ice sheet has undergone changes, but the notion of a recently ice-free continent available for ancient mariners to survey conflicts with what scientists understand about its long glacial history. And there is another problem. There are no ships. Not literally, of course. Wooden vessels from remote prehistory would rarely survive, but archaeology works through traces. A civilization capable of surveying distant continents would require more than a single lucky voyage. It would need maritime technology, navigation, shipbuilding. Food storage organization, a tradition of recording geographical information. And if it could sail repeatedly across enormous stretches of ocean and produce sophisticated maps, one might reasonably expect some evidence of that capability elsewhere. Harbors, tools, trade goods, settlements, wrecks, written traditions, images of ships, something. The theory asks for an advanced maritime culture whose greatest achievement survives almost entirely as a possible resemblance on much later maps. That is a heavy burden for one line of ink to carry. Still, the idea remains popular, partly because lost civilizations are deeply attractive. They transform gaps in knowledge into hidden rooms. A missing document becomes evidence of suppression. An unexplained shape becomes a surviving fragment of forgotten wisdom. A map becomes a message. There is a human reason for this attraction. History is full of genuine losses. The city of Troy was once treated by some as little more than legend before archaeological work transformed the discussion. Ancient writing systems have been forgotten and later deciphered. Cities have disappeared beneath forests. Shipwrecks have rested unnoticed beneath seas for centuries. Entire cultures are known only through fragments. So it is not foolish to believe that the past still contains surprises. It certainly does. The difficulty is distinguishing a surprise from a story we would like to be true. The Piri Reis Map sits exactly on that boundary. Its southern coastline is strange enough to invite questions, but strangeness alone is not proof. A useful comparison can be found in the way people see shapes in the night sky. Take a handful of stars. Connect them with imagined lines. Soon there is a hunter, a lion, a scorpion, a great bear. The stars are real. The pattern is created by the observer. Old maps can work the same way. Every cape and bay is real ink. But the identity assigned to the whole shape may come from the person looking at it centuries later. When researchers who reject the Antarctica theory examine Piri's southern coast, they tend to see an exaggerated and distorted South America. This interpretation has several advantages. It requires no unknown civilization. It fits the geographical interests of Piri's own period. It matches his use of Portuguese information, and it explains why the coast continues from Brazil without a clear separation into another continent. In this reading, the mysterious land is not Antarctica at all. It is Patagonia, stretched, rotated, and bent eastward. Perhaps the mapmaker is trying to fit the coast onto the available parchment. Perhaps his sources contain incorrect directions. Perhaps he is combining reports that do not belong together. Or perhaps several of these problems occur at once. Early maps can be wonderfully accurate and wonderfully wrong on the same sheet. There is no contradiction in that. A sailor may know one coastline personally and copy another from a poor source. A cartographer may position an island correctly while making a continent too wide. A river can be placed carefully beside a completely imaginary mountain range. Accuracy does not spread evenly across parchment. Piri's world is stitched together. Some stitches are tight, others are loose, and the farther one moves toward regions poorly known to his sources, the more visible those loose stitches become. The Antarctic theory gained particular attention because later researchers attempted to compare Piri's coastline with surveys of the land beneath the ice. The idea sounds almost irresistible when phrased simply. An ancient map matches a modern scientific survey. But simplicity can hide difficult choices. Which points on the old map correspond to which points on Antarctica? How much rotation is permitted? How much distortion? What projection is assumed? What happens to the portions that do not match? And could another coastline produce a similar resemblance if treated with the same flexibility? These are less exciting questions. They are also the questions on which extraordinary claims often depend. A mysterious map does not need to match perfectly to become famous. It needs only enough resemblance for a story to begin. Then the story travels faster than the technical objections. Soon the map is no longer described as something that might show Antarctica. It becomes the map that shows Antarctica. Then another phrase is added, without ice, then another, mapped thousands of years before recorded history. With each retelling, uncertainty quietly disappears. Perhaps that is one of the oldest habits in storytelling. A sailor says he saw something in the mist. The next person says he saw an island. The next says it was an island filled with gold. By the time the tale reaches another harbour, someone is already planning an expedition. Piri himself would probably understand the process. His world is filled with reports from distant seas. He knows that information changes as it travels. One can almost imagine him raising an eyebrow at the later history of his own map. He had openly explained that he used multiple sources. He had drawn what he believed those sources allowed him to draw. Centuries later, a single portion of the parchment becomes detached from that context and asked to prove something enormous. Yet the failure of the extraordinary theory does not make Antarctica less mysterious. Quite the opposite. The real continent is stranger than the imaginary one. Beneath the ice are mountains no human eye has seen directly. There are lakes sealed beneath immense frozen sheets. There are valleys hidden in darkness. Layers of ice preserve traces of ancient atmospheres. Tiny bubbles trapped inside frozen cores contain air from ages before recorded history. The ice is itself an archive. Instead of preserving a forgotten map, Antarctica preserves old climates. Scientists can drill downward and recover cores formed from snowfall accumulated year after year. Each layer contains clues: dust, chemical signatures, gas. The farther down one travels, the farther backward the record reaches. Piri had parchment. Antarctica has ice. Both preserve fragments. Both require interpretation, and both can be misunderstood if the reader approaches them already knowing what they hope to find. There is something fitting about that. The famous theory asks us to remove Antarctica's ice so that the continent can match an old map. But perhaps the ice is the more important historical document. It tells us that the simple story of a recently green Antarctica does not work. It pushes the supposed lost civilization farther and farther backward until it disappears beyond the boundaries of known human history. The romantic possibility becomes quieter. The evidence becomes colder still. There is one final temptation. Perhaps Piri's map did not preserve an actual survey at all. Perhaps it inherited something more abstract from ancient geography, an imagined southern continent. A land that philosophers and mapmakers believed ought to exist. This possibility carries us away from ships and glaciers and into libraries. For centuries before Antarctica was confirmed, educated mapmakers placed enormous southern lands on their worlds. They gave them shapes, coasts, mountains, sometimes even names. They drew a continent no one had properly seen, and sometimes by accident, imagination can appear remarkably close to reality. The wind moves again across the Antarctic plateau. Nothing answers. No ancient harbour emerges from the snow. No forgotten fleet waits beneath the ice. There is only the slow movement of glaciers toward the sea. Yet under those glaciers lies a genuine hidden landscape, stranger and more complicated than any 16th century mapmaker could have known. And this may be the reflective twist at the heart of the mystery. Piri's map does not need to reveal Antarctica beneath the ice to show us something hidden. It reveals how easily later generations can mistake uncertainty for secret knowledge. The empty spaces of history invite stories. Sometimes the stories are true. Sometimes they are almost true, and sometimes the most interesting thing about them is why people wanted to believe them in the first place. Now we move from the white silence of Antarctica toward another old sheet of parchment, another southern continent, and another mapmaker whose work will seem strangely prophetic to later eyes. His name is Orons Finet. And once again, a land that has not yet been properly explored is already waiting on the map. The ice keeps its silence. For anyone hoping to find a forgotten fleet hidden beneath the snow, this is perhaps a little disappointing. But history often becomes more interesting when the most dramatic explanation begins to fade, because the question now changes. Instead of asking whether ancient sailors saw Antarctica without ice, one can ask something quieter. Why did mapmakers draw enormous southern lands before they knew Antarctica was there? The answer carries us back into a world of manuscripts, geometry, philosophy, and educated guesswork. Long before Piri Reis sits down with his collection of charts, people around the Mediterranean have already spent centuries trying to imagine the shape of the Earth. The ancient Greeks know that the Earth is spherical. This fact sometimes surprises modern listeners because a persistent myth claims that educated people in the distant past believed the Earth was flat. Some certainly did. Human beings have held almost every imaginable idea at one time or another. But among educated Greek thinkers, the spherical Earth becomes well established. The harder problem is not the shape of the planet. It is the arrangement of land upon it. A person standing on the shore near Alexandria can observe the sea. A merchant can travel towards Syria. A soldier can march through Anatolia. A sailor can cross toward Italy. But most of the planet remains beyond direct experience. Geography, therefore, develops through a mixture of observation and reasoning. Sometimes the reasoning is brilliant. Sometimes it is wonderfully wrong. One influential idea is that the known lands of the north might require some kind of balancing landmass in the south. The concept changes across centuries and is never held in exactly the same way by every scholar. But eventually, European maps begin showing a great southern territory. It becomes known as Terra Australis, the southern land. Later, the phrase Terra Australis Incognita appears, the unknown southern land. That last word matters, unknown. The mapmakers are not necessarily claiming to have walked its beaches. They are representing a geographical expectation. There is a difference between drawing something because a sailor has measured it and drawing something because a theory suggests it should exist. Old maps contain both kinds of lines. The difficulty for later viewers is knowing which is which. A coastline looks confident even when the idea behind it is uncertain. Ink does not tremble simply because the cartographer lacks evidence. This brings us to a French scholar named Laurence Finet. He is born near the end of the 15th century and becomes known as a mathematician, astronomer, and cartographer. His name appears in several forms in historical writing, which is one of those small inconveniences the past leaves for anyone trying to organize it neatly. He belongs to a generation fascinated by the mathematical description of the world. Printing is spreading information more widely. Classical texts are being studied with renewed intensity. Exploration is pouring new geographical reports into Europe. The old world picture is being revised almost faster than maps can be printed. Finet produces a world map during the early 16th century, and along its southern portion appears a huge continent. It is unmistakable. There are coastlines, there are bays, there are rivers, there are mountains. To a modern eye, the temptation arrives almost immediately: Antarctica. Once the idea takes hold, the details seem to cooperate. The southern continent surrounds the pole. It has projecting peninsulas. It contains features that can be compared with real Antarctic geography. And just as with Piri Reis, some later writers argue that the resemblance is too good to be coincidence. Perhaps they suggest Finet is also copying ancient source maps. Perhaps both cartographers preserve fragments of a geographical tradition far older than themselves. Now the mystery appears to have company. One strange map can be dismissed. Two feel more persuasive. Then other old maps are added. Soon an entire hidden archive seems to emerge, but there is a problem. Finet's southern continent is not simply a secret version of Antarctica. It belongs clearly to the cartographic tradition of Terra Australis. The land is enormous, far larger in its imagined extent than the real Antarctic continent. Its shape reflects geographical theories circulating in Finet's own period. It is not necessary to invent prehistoric surveyors to explain why it appears. Mapmakers already expect a southern land. So they draw one. The details can be imaginative. A river is easy to add, mountains are easy to add. A bay makes a coastline look plausible. The result feels observed even when much of it is theoretical. This is an important lesson when reading old maps. Decoration can disguise uncertainty. A blank region labeled unknown looks uncertain. A region filled with mountains and rivers feels authoritative, yet both may rest on the same limited evidence. Cartographers are also artists. They have customers. A beautiful map must look complete. Empty parchment can seem like wasted parchment, so unknown spaces acquire creatures, ships, windheads, legends, imagined islands, and speculative geography. The world becomes visually full before it becomes geographically known. Finney's southern continent belongs partly to this culture. It is a solution to an intellectual problem. There should be land in the south. Very well, here it is. The coastline curls around the bottom of the world. A modern viewer, already knowing Antarctica exists, experiences a strange sensation. The old cartographer appears to have predicted something. In a broad sense, he has. There is indeed a great continent in the far south, but correct prediction is not the same as accurate knowledge. A person can reach the right answer for the wrong reason. Imagine someone standing in medieval York and predicting that an unknown island exists somewhere in a vast unexplored ocean. Given enough ocean, the guess might be correct. But finding an island later would not prove that the person had possessed a secret chart of it. The same caution applies to Terra Australis. A hypothetical southern land can accidentally overlap with a real southern land. The resemblance becomes even more tempting because Antarctica is roughly centered on the South Pole. The imagined continent is also placed there. Two shapes occupying the same general region will naturally invite comparison. But once again, the details matter. And the details are less miraculous. Finney's world contains geographical misunderstandings common to his era. The great southern land reaches into latitudes where open ocean actually exists. Its relationship with nearby regions reflects incomplete exploration. Its shape changes in later maps as new information arrives. This is exactly what one would expect if cartographers are adjusting a hypothesis. It is not what one would expect if they possess a precise ancient survey. A precise survey should become clearer when copied carefully. An imagined continent behaves differently. It shrinks, moves, breaks apart, acquires new capes, loses old ones. It responds to exploration. Terra Australis does exactly this. As European sailors enter more southern waters without encountering the expected land, mapmakers push its coastline farther away. The unknown continent retreats before ships. That is almost poetic. Every voyage removes a little imagination from the map. Not all imagination, of course. Sailors are excellent at creating new mysteries while solving old ones. But the southern land becomes increasingly constrained by observation. This process takes centuries. Explorers cross dangerous waters. Storms force ships off course. Cold becomes severe. Ice appears. Eventually, real Antarctic geography begins replacing hypothetical geography. The imagined continent does not transform smoothly into the real one. It is gradually dismantled. That distinction matters enormously. If Finney had inherited a genuine map of Antarctica, later explorers should have been able to use it. They should have found recognizable capes and bays. Instead, the old southern continent behaves like speculation, useful perhaps as an idea, not useful as a sailing chart. The contrast with Portolan charts is striking. A good Mediterranean Portolan can guide a sailor between known coasts with impressive precision. Harbors occupy practical positions. Islands matter because a ship may actually strike them. These maps are grounded in accumulated navigation. Terra Australis is different. No merchant is routinely sailing along its imagined rivers. No pilot is passing detailed instructions from father to son about its harbors. Its geography is intellectual rather than practical. And that difference can often be felt in the map itself. Still, the old southern continent has a strange beauty. Imagine looking at Finney's map when it is new. The paper is clean, the ink is dark. The world seems both familiar and enormous. Europe occupies its place. Africa stretches south. The Americas remain comparatively new additions to European geographical thought, and beneath everything sits a vast, mysterious land. No one in Paris can say with confidence what lives there. Perhaps there are kingdoms, perhaps forests, perhaps strange animals, perhaps mountains rich with metals, perhaps nothing but cold. For a person in the 16th century, the unknown is not abstract. It has physical space. There are still enormous regions where European maps are built from fragments that must create a very different relationship with the world. Today, almost every major coastline can be viewed in seconds. The planet feels visually complete. Finney lives before that completion. His world still has room for entire imagined continents. Perhaps that is why old maps feel so dreamlike. They show not only where people believed places were, they show where uncertainty lived. The southern continent is uncertainty given a coastline. And once uncertainty has a coastline, later generations can mistake it for knowledge. This is how the mystery grows. Piri Reis draws a strange southern extension. Finney draws Terra Australis. Later mapmakers draw their own versions. Each becomes another piece in a puzzle that appears to point backward towards some lost source. But there is another possibility. They are not copying one impossible ancient map. They are sharing ideas. Cartographers read other cartographers. They inherit traditions. They borrow decorative conventions. They copy errors. They update older geography without removing every outdated assumption. Maps have ancestry just as families do. A strange feature can survive not because it is true, but because nobody has yet gathered enough evidence to kill it. Some islands remain on maps for centuries despite never existing. Sailors search for them occasionally, they report seeing them. Fog helps, distance helps, expectation helps even more. Then another mapmaker copies the island. Now there are 2 sources, soon there are 5. Quantity begins to imitate confirmation. But every version may descend from the same original mistake. This is why historians care so much about the genealogy of maps. Several documents do not necessarily represent several independent observations. They may be cousins, or children, or copies of copies. The mystery of Antarctica therefore becomes partly a mystery of inheritance. Where did each line come from? Which features were observed? Which were borrowed? Which were guessed? Which were copied simply because an older map looked respectable? These questions lead naturally toward one of the most famous cartographers who ever lived, a man whose name still appears whenever people discuss the problem of flattening the globe. Gerardus Mercator. His maps will influence navigation for centuries. And like other cartographers of his age, he too will give space to a vast southern continent. Not because he has stood upon Antarctic ice. Not because he has inherited a perfect prehistoric satellite view of the Earth, but because even one of history's greatest mapmakers must work with the knowledge available in his own time. The forgotten world does not vanish when better mathematics arrives. It merely becomes more carefully drawn. So let us leave Orons Finney at his desk, surrounded by books, instruments, and fresh paper. Outside, Europe is changing. Ships are returning from oceans once known mainly through rumor. Printers are multiplying maps faster than scribes ever could. Every new voyage threatens an old assumption. And somewhere on those maps, beneath the known continents, Terra Australis waits patiently for another generation of cartographers to reshape it. Let us cross from the crowded study of Orons Finney into another room, another generation, and another attempt to persuade a round Earth to behave itself upon a flat sheet of paper. By now, the world of European cartography is moving quickly. Ships have crossed oceans that earlier generations knew mostly through rumor. The Atlantic no longer ends in an uncertain western emptiness. The coastlines of the Americas are becoming more familiar. Portuguese and Spanish navigators have carried geographical information across enormous distances, and yet the world remains unfinished. There are still empty spaces. There are still uncertain coasts. There are still places where a cartographer has to decide whether to leave the parchment blank or allow imagination to complete the line. Into this changing world comes Gerardus Mercator. His name will eventually become so closely associated with maps that people who know almost nothing about his life may still have heard of the Mercator projection. He is born in the early 16th century in the Low Countries, in a region connected to trade, scholarship, printing, and the movement of ideas across Europe. Mercator is more than a man who draws attractive coastlines. He studies mathematics. He works with geographical instruments. He produces globes, he engraves maps, and he thinks deeply about one of the most annoying problems in cartography. The Earth is curved, paper is not. The problem sounds simple until someone tries to solve it. Take the skin of an orange, peel it carefully. Now try to press the peel flat on a table without tearing, stretching, or distorting it. Something has to give. The same is true of the globe. A flat map cannot preserve every geographical relationship perfectly. Distances change, areas change, shapes change, directions change, different projections sacrifice different things. Mercator's famous solution becomes especially valuable for navigation because a sailor can represent a constant compass bearing as a straight line. This is extremely useful aboard a ship, but the projection also produces distortions, especially toward the poles. Regions in high latitudes appear much larger than they truly are. Greenland can look enormous. Northern lands stretch outward. The poles themselves create severe difficulties. This matters for our story because old maps are sometimes compared with modern geography as though both were photographs taken from above. They are not. Projection can change apparent shape dramatically. And when a modern observer tries to rotate, stretch, or reinterpret an ancient coastline until it resembles Antarctica, the mathematical structure of the original map becomes important. A coastline is not simply a coastline, it exists inside a system. Mercator understands this better than most people of his age. And yet even Mercator draws things he cannot know. On maps associated with his work, the southern reaches of the globe contain a great landmass, Terra Australis. The unknown southern land survives. It appears with an impressive confidence. Coasts run around the bottom of the world. Names occupy portions of it. The shape seems deliberate. Once again, the modern eye is tempted. There really is a continent in the south. Surely these mapmakers knew something. Perhaps they possessed older charts. Perhaps some forgotten sailors had already been there. But the southern land on maps of Mercator's era does not correspond neatly to the real Antarctica. It belongs to the same broad tradition that shaped the work of earlier cartographers. The hypothetical continent remains useful because the southern world is still poorly explored. No ship has yet traced Antarctica's coastline. No surveyor has measured its mountains. No traveler has crossed its interior. There is no practical Antarctic geographical tradition available to Mercator, so the old idea survives. This is not unusual. Knowledge rarely changes all at once. When new evidence appears, old beliefs do not immediately vanish. They linger in books, in classrooms, in habits, and on maps. Sometimes an outdated geographical feature survives because nobody has proved it wrong, sometimes because a respected authority included it, sometimes because removing it would leave an uncomfortable blank, and sometimes because the feature still seems logically possible. Terra Australis benefits from all of these conditions. The southern oceans are enormous. Very few European sailors have entered the coldest reaches. A great continent could be there. So mapmakers keep drawing it. The interesting part is what happens as exploration continues. The southern continent begins to retreat. Voyagers sail through regions where maps suggest land should exist. They find water. That is useful evidence. A coastline moves farther south. Another expedition finds more open sea. The hypothetical land shrinks again. This is geography being corrected by absence. There is something wonderfully patient about the process. A ship does not need to discover a continent to change a map. Sometimes it changes the map simply by failing to find one. Imagine a captain sailing across a stretch of ocean where a respected chart suggests a coast may appear. Day after day, there is nothing, only waves, birds occasionally, cloud, rain, the horizon. The crew watches for mountains. None rise. At night, the captain makes notes. Latitude, wind, direction, still no land. When that information reaches a cartographer, an imagined coastline becomes harder to defend. The blank space returns. Later, another expedition crosses a neighboring region, more ocean. The southern land retreats again. By the time European explorers begin approaching the real Antarctic continent, Terra Australis has already undergone centuries of adjustment. The theoretical land and the real land slowly separate. This is crucial. If early maps contained accurate inherited surveys of Antarctica, one might expect later exploration to confirm their details. Instead, exploration dismantles many of them. The imaginary coastline does not sharpen into the Antarctic coastline. It disappears. Then actual coastlines are added from new observation. Reality replaces expectation, yet even this process is not neat. Consider the name Australia. It carries an echo of the old southern idea. The Latin word australis means southern. For centuries, the imagined Terra Australis occupies the bottom of maps. Eventually, the name becomes associated with a very real landmass farther north than Antarctica. A geographical theory leaves behind a linguistic fossil. Names can survive even when the ideas that created them change. Maps are full of such ghosts, old names, misunderstood names, names given by explorers who believed they were somewhere else, names translated from local languages and altered beyond recognition. Names honoring rulers who never saw the places carrying them. The world map is not simply geography, it is memory layered over geography. Mercator's work reminds us of another important fact. A cartographer can be brilliant and still be wrong. There is no shame in this. Scientific and geographical progress depend upon people creating the best models they can from incomplete information. The model is corrected when better evidence arrives. Mercator's mathematical contribution to navigation can be enormously important, even while some geographical content on maps of his era remains speculative. This is difficult for the modern mind because old maps often appear authoritative. The lettering is beautiful. The lines are careful. Sea monsters curl between ships. Mountains stand in neat little rows. Everything looks intentional, but confidence of appearance is not confidence of evidence. A mapmaker may engrave an uncertain coast just as carefully as a known one. The copper plate does not distinguish between observation and rumor. The reader must, and so the great southern continent continues to exist on paper. It becomes almost a character in the history of cartography. Always waiting, always enormous, always just beyond the routes sailors have confirmed. Some maps make it mountainous, others divide it with rivers, some bring it close to South America. Others stretch it toward the lands south of Asia. The details vary because the continent itself is not being copied from a consistent survey. It is being negotiated. Theory and rumor argue with exploration. Each new voyage edits the argument. And this brings us back to Piri Reis. His strange southern coastline is often pulled out of this wider world and treated as an isolated miracle. But place it beside the maps that come before and after, and the atmosphere changes. Suddenly, strange southern geography is everywhere. Not because everyone secretly knows Antarctica, because almost nobody knows it. Uncertainty produces variety. One map bends South America eastward. Another gives the world an enormous Terra Australis. Another invents islands. Another moves them, another removes them. The unknown is unstable. Real geography tends to become more consistent as observations accumulate. Imagined geography tends to wander. That distinction is one of the historian's quiet tools. Look for stability. If independent sailors repeatedly measure the same cape, its position becomes harder to move. If a landmass changes dramatically from one map to another, something else may be happening. Expectation, guesswork, copying, misunderstanding, or all of them together. By the later centuries of exploration, ships begin pushing deeper into southern waters. The voyages are difficult, the seas become violent. Cold penetrates wooden hulls and damp clothing. Sailors wake to frozen ropes. Fog closes around ships. Ice appears where open water had been expected. The imagined southern paradise, sometimes associated with fertile unknown lands, becomes harder to maintain. The far south is not welcoming, it is severe. Eventually, navigators cross enormous stretches of southern ocean without finding the giant temperate continent that older maps promised. The old Terra Australis begins to die, not dramatically. No king announces its death. No scholar holds a funeral. Mapmakers simply stop drawing so much of it. One coastline disappears, then another. Blank ocean takes its place. This may be one of the strangest ways an imaginary place can end. Not with destruction, with erasure. Ink stops being applied. And then, after centuries of speculation, explorers encounter the true Antarctic world. It is not the great inhabited balancing continent of imagination. It is colder, more isolated, more difficult. Ice dominates the horizon, the interior is almost inaccessible. Human beings have finally reached the region that maps had populated with guesses for generations, and reality is stranger than the drawings. There is a certain irony here. For centuries, cartographers invent a southern continent because they believe the world may need one. When explorers finally confirm that a southern continent truly exists, it looks almost nothing like the imagined versions. The map makers are broadly right and specifically wrong. There is land, just not the land they drew. This is a useful thought to carry back toward the Piri Reis mystery. A correct idea can emerge from incorrect reasoning. A resemblance can exist without a direct connection. A map can place land where land really exists without having surveyed that land. Coincidence is not always a satisfying explanation, but history contains a great deal of coincidence. So does geography. Perhaps somewhere in Flanders, a printer lifts a fresh map from a press. The ink is still dark. The paper smells faintly of oil. At the bottom of the world sits Terra Australis. A customer buys the map. He takes it home. Perhaps he hangs it on a wall. Perhaps a child studies the strange southern continent and wonders who lives there. The child will never see Antarctica. Neither will Mercator. Neither did Piri Reis. But the imagined land will continue to shape expectations until ships finally enter the cold waters and begin replacing theory with observation. This is how maps learn, slowly, one voyage at a time, one correction at a time, one vanished mistake at a time. And perhaps this is why the Piri Reis map remains so compelling. It belongs to the brief period when the world is becoming recognizable but has not yet become familiar. Enough is known to create astonishing maps. Enough remains unknown to create astonishing mistakes. Those two things occupy the same parchment: accuracy and error, observation and imagination, memory and rumor. But another question waits beneath all of this. Suppose the extraordinary interpretation is wrong. Suppose Piri Reis did not possess a map of ice-free Antarctica. Suppose Oronce Finet and Mercator were not copying charts from a vanished global civilization. Then why has the theory remained so powerful? Why do people return to it? Why does a single curved coastline continue to inspire claims about civilizations lost before written history? To answer that, we have to move away from the maps themselves. We have to follow the people who rediscovered them, interpreted them, argued over them, and transformed old cartographic uncertainties into a modern legend. So we leave the great southern continent of imagination behind. The old ink fades. The ships move north. The cold horizon disappears. And waiting ahead is a much newer mystery, not a mystery created in the 16th century. A mystery created when the 20th century looked backward and decided that perhaps the old mapmakers had known far more than they ever admitted. We drift onward now, away from the imagined southern continents and back toward the old parchment itself. By the 20th century, the world has changed almost beyond anything Piri Reis could have imagined. Steamships have crossed oceans once navigated by sail. Railways have cut across continents. Aircraft have risen above landscapes that earlier mapmakers knew only through reports from travelers. The polar regions, though still dangerous and remote, are no longer empty spaces filled entirely by speculation. Explorers have reached Antarctica. Expeditions have crossed portions of its interior. Scientists have begun studying its glaciers, mountains, weather, and ancient ice. The white region at the bottom of the globe is becoming a place of measurement rather than imagination. And this is precisely the moment when an old map begins a second life. The surviving fragment associated with Piri Reis comes to scholarly attention after it is found among the collections of the former Ottoman imperial palace in Istanbul. The discovery is remarkable even without Antarctica. Here is a map produced in the early 16th century, close to the first generations of sustained European voyages across the Atlantic. It contains geographical information connected with a world that is changing rapidly. It may preserve material derived from maps that no longer survive. For historians of cartography, that alone is enough to make the parchment precious. But mysteries rarely remain confined to specialists. The strange southern coastline begins attracting attention. Comparisons are made, questions are asked, and gradually the map becomes associated with an extraordinary possibility. Perhaps the southern coast is Antarctica. Perhaps it shows the continent without ice. Perhaps the map therefore preserves information far older than Piri Reis himself. The theory receives one of its most influential advocates in Charles Hapgood. Hapgood is a 20th century scholar who becomes deeply interested in old maps and what they might reveal about forgotten geographical knowledge. He does not believe Piri personally sailed to Antarctica. That would be impossible to reconcile with Piri's known life and with the mapmaker's own explanation of his sources. Instead, Hapgood proposes a chain of inheritance. The idea is almost like a historical whisper passing through thousands of years. An unknown civilization maps parts of the world in remote antiquity. Its original charts disappear, but copies survive. Later cultures inherit them. Greek scholars preserve some information. Other copies travel through libraries and empires. Eventually, fragments reach medieval and early modern cartographers. Piri Reis unknowingly becomes one of the final links in a chain whose beginning has been forgotten. It is a wonderfully cinematic idea. Imagine a map copied in a temple or library thousands of years ago. The original surveyor's name is already forgotten. A scribe traces the coastline. Centuries pass. The copy travels to another city, perhaps Alexandria, perhaps somewhere around the eastern Mediterranean. Another scholar copies it. A war comes. The library scatters. A manuscript survives in a private collection. It passes through Byzantine hands, then perhaps through Arabic-speaking scholars. Eventually, a later copy reaches a Mediterranean sailor. And finally, Piri places a fragment of its geography onto his own world map. One can almost hear the parchment rustling through the centuries. But the beauty of a chain does not prove the existence of its first link. This is where the theory encounters difficulty. Historians know that ancient knowledge can survive through copying. There is nothing extraordinary about that mechanism. Many classical works survive precisely because generations of scribes copied them. The question is whether there is evidence for the specific advanced geographical knowledge Hapgood's theory requires. And there, the trail becomes very thin. There is no surviving ancient global survey, no confirmed prehistoric chart of Antarctica, no archaeological evidence for the kind of worldwide maritime civilization necessary to produce such mapping. The theory begins with the maps it is trying to explain. Then it imagines the civilization required to explain them. This creates a dangerous circle. A strange coastline is treated as evidence of an unknown civilization. Then the unknown civilization is used to explain the strange coastline. Each supports the other. But neither has independent evidence strong enough to carry the full argument. The ice creates another problem. If Antarctica had been mapped without its modern ice cover, the original survey would have to belong to a period far outside the timeline of known civilization. Hapgood explored unconventional ideas about shifts in the Earth's crust to explain how polar conditions might have changed. Such ideas attracted attention beyond academic geography. They offered a mechanism by which Antarctica could once have occupied a warmer position and later become frozen. But this proposed history of rapid crustal displacement is not supported by the modern understanding of plate tectonics and Antarctic geology in the way required by the theory. Continents do move. They move enormously over geological time. Antarctica itself has traveled across the planet during its deep history. But that movement occurs over immense spans of time. It does not place a green Antarctica within the convenient reach of an advanced human civilization a few thousand years ago. Again, the clocks refuse to agree. Human history says one thing, ice says another, geology says another. The extraordinary map theory needs all of them to meet. They do not. Yet the story spreads. This is not surprising. A mystery with a lost civilization is easier to remember than a discussion about cartographic projection. A hidden ancient survey is more exciting than a distorted South American coastline. The dramatic version fits comfortably into books, documentaries, conversations, and late-night speculation. With each retelling, the cautious language can weaken. Some believe the map may represent Antarctica becomes the map represents Antarctica. Then Antarctica becomes Antarctica without ice. Then the map becomes proof that someone surveyed the continent in remote antiquity. The story hardens. Possibility becomes fact through repetition. There is an irony here that Piri Reis might have appreciated. His own map was assembled from information traveling between people, Now the legend surrounding his map travels in much the same way. Each person copies the previous version. Small changes appear, uncertainty is lost, details become sharper. The story begins behaving like an old map. And just as a copied coastline can drift away from its original shape, a copied claim can drift away from its original evidence. This does not mean the people interested in the mystery are foolish. Curiosity is valuable. Old maps should be questioned. Historical assumptions should be challenged when evidence deserves it. Many important discoveries begin with someone noticing that the accepted explanation does not quite fit. The danger comes only when the desire for a surprising answer becomes stronger than the evidence. There is a quiet discipline required in history. Sometimes the answer is, "We do not know." Those four words can feel unsatisfying. They leave the door open without telling us what is behind it. But they are often more accurate than a beautiful theory. There are things about Piri's map that remain uncertain. The exact identity of every source he used cannot be reconstructed. Some of the charts he consulted are gone. The surviving fragment does not preserve the complete world map. The transmission of particular geographical details may never be known. Those are genuine mysteries. They do not need Antarctica to make them interesting. Consider the lost Columbus material. If Piri truly incorporated information from a chart associated with Columbus or a sailor who accompanied his voyages, historians would dearly like to know exactly what that source contained. How did it represent the Caribbean? What did it say about the mainland? How did its maker understand the relationship between the new lands and Asia? Did Piri copy it closely? Did he alter it to fit other sources? Those questions belong to real historical uncertainty. The answers may have disappeared forever. There is also the broader question of Portuguese cartographic knowledge. Portugal's navigators were accumulating valuable information during Piri's lifetime. Some maps were carefully controlled, others circulated. The movement of this knowledge into Ottoman hands tells us something about the limits of secrecy. A state can declare information confidential. The sea may have other plans. A storm can separate a ship from its fleet. A battle can put a chart into enemy hands. A sailor can be captured. A map can be sold. A copy can be made in a night. The information escapes. Perhaps somewhere in an Ottoman port, a Portuguese chart is unrolled across a table. The corners curl upward. Piri leans over it. The handwriting is foreign. Someone translates a note. A finger follows the coast of Brazil. Another chart is placed beside it. The coast does not quite agree. Piri must choose. That moment is lost. No record tells us what he thought. But it is far more plausible than a prehistoric fleet sailing along an ice-free Antarctic shore. And strangely, it may also be more human. History is often made from people comparing imperfect information. They rarely know which of their sources will survive. They rarely know which mistake will fascinate later generations. Piri certainly does not. He continues his career. He writes about navigation. He produces detailed descriptions of Mediterranean coasts and islands. His famous Book of the Sea demonstrates the practical depth of his maritime knowledge. That work is perhaps a better guide to understanding him than the legends attached to one strange coastline. Here is a sailor interested in real harbors. Real winds, real islands, real routes. He belongs to the practical world of ships. That does not sound like a man hiding evidence of an impossible civilization. It sounds like an experienced navigator collecting every useful piece of information he can find. The final years of his life are less peaceful than the modern mystery surrounding his map might suggest. Piri serves the Ottoman state in naval campaigns. He lives into old age. Eventually, after military difficulties and political conflict, he is executed. The exact circumstances are tangled in the harsh politics of empire. His life ends, his maps remain. Then most of them disappear. For centuries, the surviving world map fragment rests quietly. Piri cannot defend it. He cannot correct it. He cannot explain that troublesome southern bend. The silence allows later generations to make him part of stories he never told. Perhaps this is unavoidable. Every historical object outlives its maker differently. A sword becomes a symbol. A ruin becomes a legend. A manuscript becomes a prophecy. A map becomes evidence of a vanished world. But there is another way to look at Piri's parchment. Instead of asking what impossible secret it contains, Ask what ordinary human connections made it possible. An Ottoman admiral, Portuguese navigators, Spanish voyages, Mediterranean sailors, classical geography, captured charts, lost manuscripts, merchants, pilots, copyists, all of them leave faint fingerprints on one surviving object. The map is not proof that one forgotten civilization knew everything. It is evidence that many civilizations knew pieces. That realization is quieter, but perhaps it is also more beautiful. Human knowledge does not arrive complete, it accumulates. One sailor learns a current, another measures a latitude. Another survives a reef and marks its location. A cartographer copies the warning. A later map maker corrects the coast. Generations pass. Eventually the world becomes familiar, and then people forget how difficult it was to make it so. The 500-year-old map remains on its parchment. Its southern coastline still bends east. Anyone can look at it and wonder. That wonder does not have to disappear simply because the most dramatic theory is weak. Mystery and skepticism can occupy the same room. One can admire the question without accepting every answer. And now, as the 20th century arguments fade behind us, one final journey remains. We have followed Piri Reis. We have followed Columbus and Portuguese navigators. We have crossed the imagined Terra Australis of Oronce Fine and Mercator. We have stood above the hidden landscape beneath Antarctic ice. Now we must return to the beginning and ask what this map actually tells us after all the legends have been stripped away. Not about a lost super-civilization, not about impossible ancient technology, but about memory, inheritance, error, and the strange way knowledge survives. And there, perhaps, the old parchment has one last secret left to give. Let us leave the 20th century arguments behind and return once more to the quieter world of old maps. The extraordinary theories have not disappeared. They are still there, waiting at the edge of the parchment, a forgotten civilization. Ancient sailors crossing unknown oceans, charts carried through burning libraries and collapsing empires, a green Antarctica beneath a warmer sky. These ideas have a certain gravity. Once encountered, they are difficult to forget. And perhaps that is why the final part of this journey should not begin by laughing at them. It should begin by asking why they feel so possible. The answer starts with a simple truth: civilizations really do disappear. Not usually without leaving any trace at all, but enough can vanish that later generations are left with fragments. A city can be abandoned. A language can become unreadable. A trade route can shift. A harbor can fill with silt. A kingdom can fall so completely that its palaces become hills beneath grass. People living nearby may eventually forget who built them. This has happened many times. Across the ancient Mediterranean, ruined settlements lie beneath later towns. In Anatolia, Syria, Egypt, Greece, Italy, and farther west, one culture often builds directly over another. A person may walk across stones shaped by hands whose names have been forgotten for thousands of years. In Britain, a farmer might once have ploughed beside a burial mound without knowing who lay inside. Not far from lands once ruled by ancestors whose names disappeared from every surviving record. Roman roads continued carrying travelers long after the empire that built them had gone. History is full of ghosts. So when someone proposes that an ancient civilization has been forgotten, the basic idea is not absurd. Many have been. The difficulty begins with scale. A forgotten village is one thing. A forgotten kingdom is possible. Even a substantial civilization can become poorly understood if its writing disappears and its cities are abandoned. But a global maritime civilization, capable of accurately surveying distant continents, is something much larger. Such a society would need infrastructure. Ships must be built somewhere. Timber must be cut. Ropes must be twisted. Sails must be woven. Food and water must be stored. Navigators must be trained. Knowledge must be recorded. If voyages are repeated across generations, ports develop traditions around them. Trade follows routes. Foreign objects move between cultures. Stories spread. And all of this tends to leave traces. Consider the known seafaring peoples of the ancient world. The Phoenicians do not vanish without evidence. Their settlements remain, their inscriptions survive, their pottery travels. Their trade networks leave material traces across the Mediterranean. The Greeks leave ships in art, maritime vocabulary and texts, harbors, cargoes, colonies, and shipwrecks. The Romans leave an overwhelming amount. Farther north, Viking voyages across the Atlantic are supported not only by stories, but by archaeological evidence. The principle is simple. Long-distance navigation leaves footprints, even when the feet are aboard ships. A prehistoric civilization capable of mapping Antarctica would need to be strangely selective in what it left behind. Its geographical knowledge survives, its ships do not, its ports do not, its navigational instruments do not, its records do not. Its settlements do not. Its trade goods do not clearly appear in the places it supposedly reached. Only echoes on maps copied thousands of years later remain. That is possible in the broad philosophical sense that many things are possible. But historical explanation requires more than possibility. It requires evidence strong enough to make one explanation better than another. And the simpler explanation for Piri's southern coast is already available. A distorted South America, incomplete Portuguese information, cartographic compression, uncertain projection, the habits of early 16th century mapmaking. These explanations are not glamorous, but they have one important advantage. We know all of those things existed. Portuguese charts existed, distortions existed, errors existed, South America was incompletely mapped. Piri tells us he used multiple sources. Nothing new has to be invented. The lost civilization theory requires an entire unknown chapter of human development that does not automatically make it false. Sometimes history does surprise us. But the larger the missing chapter, the stronger the evidence should be. One ambiguous coastline is simply not enough, and yet there is another ancient possibility worth considering. What if old sailors traveled farther than surviving records suggest? This is a much more modest idea. And here, history becomes interesting again. Ancient people were not timid. They crossed seas. They navigated using stars, winds, currents, coastal landmarks, birds, and accumulated experience. They traveled without engines, without modern weather forecasts, without satellite navigation, without accurate clocks. The fact that their technology was old does not mean it was useless. A skilled sailor knows a great deal that may never appear in a scholarly book. The sea teaches through repetition. Where does a particular wind usually come from? When do certain birds appear? What kind of cloud forms near an island? How does the color of water change over shallow ground? Which stars rise before dawn at a particular season? These observations can become a practical navigation system carried largely in memory. Some societies developed extraordinary traditions of ocean travel. The settlement of remote Pacific islands demonstrates what human beings can achieve with technologies that once seemed simple to outsiders. Vast stretches of ocean were crossed. Islands separated by enormous distances were found, settled, and revisited. This should make anyone cautious about declaring that ancient sailors could never have reached a distant place. Human beings have always been capable of uncomfortable journeys, but reaching somewhere is different from mapping it accurately. A ship blown far south might glimpse unknown land. That does not create a detailed continental survey. An accidental voyage does not automatically produce the geographical system implied by the strongest Piri Reis theories. The scale matters again. There is also a habit in modern storytelling of treating ancient people in one of two extreme ways. Either they are imagined as primitive and incapable of anything surprising, or they are transformed into possessors of mysterious knowledge more advanced than expected. Both approaches flatten the past. Ancient sailors were neither foolish nor magical. They were skilled people working with the tools and knowledge available to them. Their real achievements are impressive enough. They do not need an ice-free Antarctica. Piri Reis does not need one either. The mapmaker's actual world is filled with remarkable geographical exchange. Information travels from Portugal to Ottoman hands. Material connected with voyages across the Atlantic appears in a map produced in the Eastern Mediterranean. Classical traditions survive through copying. Knowledge crosses religious, political, and linguistic boundaries. This is not evidence of a forgotten global civilization. It is evidence of something more familiar. People talk to one another, even when their governments are enemies. Sailors steal from rivals. Merchants trade with strangers, prisoners carry memories, scholars copy foreign books, maps cross borders more easily than armies. The history of knowledge is full of these quiet acts of borrowing. And perhaps there is a lesson here about ancestry as well. A listener in York, London, Flanders, Cornwall, Edinburgh, Canterbury, or Normandy may imagine history as a line descending neatly through generations. But knowledge has no neat family tree. It is more like a river system. Streams join, separate again, disappear underground, return somewhere else. A geographical idea developed in one culture may survive because another culture preserves it. A word crosses a border. A measurement is translated. A map is copied by someone who cannot read every note written upon it. Centuries later, another person inherits the result. No single civilization owns the whole process. Piri's parchment is a beautiful example. It is Ottoman. It is also Mediterranean. It contains European geographical discoveries. It carries older traditions. It belongs to a particular man and also to a much larger network of people who never knew one another. Perhaps one Portuguese pilot contributes a cape. Perhaps a Spanish sailor contributes an island. Perhaps an earlier cartographer contributes a mistaken coastline. Piri brings them together. The map becomes a crowded room in which the dead speak without realizing they are in conversation. That may be the real lost civilization hidden in the map. Not Atlantis, not some unknown empire beneath Antarctic ice, but the civilization of ordinary knowledge. Thousands of unnamed sailors, copyists, pilots, merchants, craftsmen, interpreters, and mapmakers whose individual contributions are now impossible to separate. Most of their names are gone. Their information survives. A line on a map can outlive the person who first measured it. An error can too. This is important. We often imagine the survival of knowledge as something noble. A wise scholar preserves a precious manuscript. A careful monk copies an ancient book. A library protects the memory of the past. All of that happens. But mistakes are preserved by exactly the same mechanisms. A copyist does not always know which sentence is wrong. A cartographer does not always know which coastline is distorted. If the source looks respectable, the mistake may be repeated. Then another person copies it. Soon age itself begins to give the error authority. People assume that if a feature has appeared on maps for generations, someone must once have confirmed it. Sometimes, nobody did. This is how phantom islands survive. An island is reported, perhaps it is a cloud bank. Perhaps a sailor miscalculates his position. Perhaps two real islands are accidentally treated as separate observations. The island enters a chart. Later captains search for it. Some fail to find it, others report uncertain sightings. The map keeps the island alive. Decades pass, perhaps centuries. Eventually improved surveys remove it. The island vanishes without ever having existed. This should make the mysterious southern coast feel less lonely. Cartographic history contains many ghosts. Some are islands. Some are rivers. Some are mountains. Some are entire continents. Terra Australis is the greatest ghost of them all. For generations, it occupies a huge portion of the globe. It is printed carefully. Named, decorated, discussed. And then exploration slowly cuts it apart. Real lands emerge from the old imaginary continent. Australia becomes clearer. Southern oceans expand. Antarctica eventually appears as something different from what earlier mapmakers imagined. The ghost retreats, but traces remain. Names remain. Old maps remain. And because the real Antarctica exists in roughly the same grand southern region once occupied by speculation, the old drawings gain a strange second life. It is easy to look backward and say they knew. Perhaps it is more accurate to say they guessed. Sometimes they guessed badly, sometimes surprisingly well, and sometimes modern viewers complete the resemblance for them. The same can be said of Piri's coastline. The line is real. The parchment is real. The date is real. The older sources are real in the broad sense that Piri tells us he used them. But the conclusion that the coast must therefore be an ancient survey of ice-free Antarctica is an interpretation layered on top. Remove that interpretation, and the map does not become less valuable. It becomes more connected to its own world. Piri returns from legend to history. He is no longer the final guardian of impossible prehistoric knowledge. He is an Ottoman sailor at the beginning of a new geographical age. He gathers fragments, he compares, he copies, he makes decisions. And, inevitably, he makes mistakes. There is something reassuring about allowing him to be human. Perhaps one evening while working on the map, he reaches the southern coast. The light is fading. A lamp flickers beside him. Several charts disagree. One Portuguese source gives a coastline that continues beyond the information of another. He studies them, he thinks. Then his pen touches the parchment. The coast turns east. A small movement of the hand. Nothing dramatic. Outside, the Bosporus moves through darkness. No one notices. No one could possibly know that centuries later this bend will inspire arguments about Antarctica, geology, lost civilizations, and the memory of the ancient world. Piri continues drawing. That may be all that happened, and somehow that possibility is more haunting than the legend. A mystery lasting centuries may have begun with a mapmaker simply doing his best. The lamp burns lower, the parchment dries, and the troublesome coastline waits for the future to misunderstand it. We drift onward now toward the final part of our journey. The maps will remain behind. The lost civilizations will fade into the darkness. And one last question will remain. If the 500-year-old map does not show an ice-free Antarctica, what does it truly show us? The answer may have less to do with geography than with the way human beings remember the past. The old map rests quietly now. After all the voyages, arguments, theories, coastlines, and lost charts, we return to the same piece of parchment with which we began. Nothing about it has changed. The colors remain faded. The ships remain suspended on painted seas. The strange animals remain where an artist placed them centuries ago, and the southern coastline still bends eastward. Only our way of looking at it has changed. At first, the line seemed almost impossible. A map created in the early 16th century appeared to contain knowledge that its maker should not have possessed. Perhaps Antarctica without ice. Perhaps evidence of sailors from a civilization older than recorded history. It was a wonderfully unsettling possibility, and those are often the most attractive historical mysteries. They offer the feeling that a door has been left open somewhere in the past. Behind it lies a room nobody has entered for centuries. Perhaps there are forgotten books inside. Perhaps there are maps of coastlines no known explorer reached. Perhaps the familiar history of civilization is only the last chapter of a much older story. There is nothing wrong with feeling that attraction. Wonder is one of the reasons people study the past. But wonder becomes more useful when it can survive disappointment. And the quieter interpretation of the Piri Reis Map gives us plenty to wonder about. The parchment is extraordinary without requiring impossible knowledge. Think again about the world in which it is created. Piri Reis lives during a geographical revolution. Information from Atlantic voyages is pouring into the Mediterranean. Portuguese navigators have rounded Africa. Columbus has crossed the Western Ocean. The coast of Brazil is being explored. Old geographical traditions inherited from classical and medieval scholarship are colliding with observations made by sailors who have seen places no European mapmaker had previously drawn with confidence. And Piri gathers those fragments. He is not standing above the earth. He has no complete survey. He has no single perfect source. He has charts, reports, memories, copies, rumors, and experience. From these he attempts to construct a world. That is what makes the map beautiful. Its imperfections are not failures that need to be explained away. They are evidence of the process. A modern map hides its uncertainty well. Satellites observe the planet. Surveyors measure precise positions. Computers combine enormous collections of geographical data. A coastline can be displayed with such accuracy that the viewer forgets how difficult geography once was. Piri's map does not allow that forgetting. Its errors remain visible. The world on the parchment is still being discovered. One region is carefully known, another is stretched, an island wanders, a coastline turns strangely, and somewhere between all these uncertainties, remarkably accurate information survives. This mixture is more historically valuable than perfection would be. It shows knowledge being built. One can almost see the seams. Perhaps a Portuguese chart contributes one portion. Perhaps information connected with Columbus contributes another. Perhaps an older Mediterranean tradition shapes something else. Piri joins them. And because many of his sources are now lost, his map preserves traces of documents that time has otherwise erased. That alone makes it a kind of archive, not an archive of an ice-free Antarctica, an archive of missing maps. There is a difference, and it is a fascinating one. Somewhere in the centuries between Piri's lifetime and ours, the charts he used disappeared, perhaps one burned, perhaps another decayed, perhaps a third remained unnoticed until someone threw it away. Perhaps a beautiful chart was cut apart because parchment was useful for something else. History can be painfully casual with its treasures. An object is precious only if someone knows it should be preserved. Imagine a sailor's family cleaning a room after his death. There are ropes, old clothes, a broken instrument, several stained charts. The charts seem outdated. Newer maps exist, so they are discarded. No one pauses to wonder whether one was copied from Columbus. No one knows that scholars centuries later would have crossed oceans to study it. The paper disappears. The information survives only because another mapmaker once copied a portion of it. This is how the past often reaches us, not as a complete book, as quotations, not as a building, as foundations beneath another building, not as a life, as a name in an account book, not as a map, as a coastline copied onto another map. History is an enormous collection of leftovers, and perhaps that is why people are tempted to make the leftovers larger than they are. A fragment feels incomplete. The imagination wants to restore it. Give us one mysterious coast, and we build a lost civilization behind it. Give us a ruined wall, and we imagine a palace. Give us a strange inscription, and we imagine a forgotten religion. Sometimes imagination leads toward discovery. Sometimes it leads away from evidence. The challenge is knowing when to follow it. The Piri Reis Map teaches this lesson gently. Its mystery does not vanish when Antarctica disappears from the interpretation. Instead, another mystery emerges. How does knowledge survive? Why does one chart disappear while another remains? How much information has been lost completely? And how much of what we call discovery is actually rediscovery? These questions do not have dramatic answers, but they reach much farther than one map. Consider the great libraries of the ancient and medieval worlds. People sometimes imagine their destruction as a single catastrophic moment. Flames rise, shelves collapse. The wisdom of centuries disappears overnight. Sometimes destruction really is dramatic. But knowledge is also lost quietly. A book stops being copied, one manuscript develops mold, another is eaten by insects. A language becomes difficult to read, a text falls out of fashion, a library owner dies. A war scatters a collection. No one makes the next copy. And that is enough. A work that survived for centuries can disappear because one generation is slightly less interested than the generation before. Maps are especially vulnerable. They become outdated. A new coastline is measured more accurately. A new chart replaces the old one. The old map loses practical value. A sailor is not thinking about a museum several centuries in the future. He wants the best information available now. So yesterday's chart is neglected. Ironically, the errors that make an old map useless to a sailor can make it priceless to a historian. The historian wants to know what people believed. The mistake becomes evidence. Peary's strange southern bend is valuable for exactly this reason. Whether it comes from a source error, a problem of scale, an uncertain projection, or a decision made to fit the coast onto parchment, it tells us something about the limits of geographical knowledge in his time. The mistake has survived its correction. That is a curious form of immortality. The real coastline of South America is now known. Antarctica has been mapped. The geographical uncertainty that produced the mystery is gone. But the old uncertain line remains. In a sense, error has become more durable than usefulness. Perhaps Piri would find that amusing. He was, after all, a practical sailor. He created works intended to help navigators understand coasts and waters. If shown a modern chart, he would probably be far more interested in its accuracy than in defending an old mistake. One can imagine him studying the true southern end of South America. He sees the strait, the islands, the open water beyond. Then Antarctica farther south. Perhaps he looks back at his parchment. The comparison is not flattering, but sailors understand correction. A wrong chart is not sacred, it is replaced. And yet we keep the wrong chart because it shows the path toward the right one. This is how knowledge grows, not through an uninterrupted line of genius. Through correction, a sailor measures, a mapmaker draws. Another sailor discovers the drawing is wrong. Another mapmaker changes it. A later expedition measures more carefully. The coast shifts again. Eventually the arguments become smaller. The blank spaces shrink. The world becomes familiar. But familiarity has a cost. It can make people forget the wonder of uncertainty. Piri's generation could look west and know that enormous questions remained. A ship leaving port might return with a coastline that forced scholars to redraw part of the world. Imagine living with that possibility. A map is not finished. The Earth itself seems unfinished because knowledge of it remains incomplete. Perhaps that is what draws modern people toward old cartographic mysteries. The maps restore uncertainty. They return us briefly to a world where the edges are still soft, where an island may exist, where a southern continent may be enormous, where the report of one sailor can alter geography. The Piri Reis Map gives the modern world something modern maps rarely can: room to wonder. And Antarctica is almost perfectly designed to receive that wonder. It is distant, cold, mostly empty of permanent human settlement. Its interior remained unknown for far longer than most inhabited regions. Beneath the ice lies a landscape hidden from ordinary sight. Mountains, basins, valleys, ancient geological structures. There really is a hidden continent there. Just not the hidden continent the legend requires. Perhaps that is the final irony. The truth is already strange. Antarctica does not need a prehistoric civilization. Its ice preserves climates older than civilization itself. Its rocks tell stories from worlds before humanity. Its hidden lakes have remained isolated beneath immense ice. Its mountains rise beneath a surface that conceals much of their shape. The real mystery operates on a timescale far greater than any lost kingdom. And Piri's map operates on another timescale. Human memory. A few centuries. Long enough for sources to disappear, long enough for intentions to become uncertain. Long enough for a mistake to become a mystery. The two timescales meet only in our imagination. Ancient ice, old parchment, a curved coastline, a modern viewer. From those pieces, a legend is born. There is no shame in enjoying the legend. Stories have always grown around maps. Sailors once filled unknown seas with islands. Artists drew monsters in distant waters. Merchants exaggerated rich kingdoms. Travelers returned with tales of enormous creatures and strange peoples. The boundary between geography and storytelling was never perfectly clean. Perhaps it still is not. The important thing is to know when we have crossed it. So tonight, as the old parchment is folded away in our imagination, the mystery becomes smaller, but it does not become dull. Piri Reis probably did not possess secret knowledge of an ice-free Antarctica. The southern coastline is much more plausibly connected with an incomplete and distorted understanding of South America. The great southern continents on other early maps are better understood through the long tradition of Terra Australis, the hypothetical land that cartographers placed in the unknown south. And the geological history of Antarctica does not fit comfortably with the idea that a forgotten human civilization surveyed its exposed coastline in remote antiquity. Those conclusions close one door. Behind it was a spectacular story. But another door remains open. Behind this one are real people. Piri, his uncle Portuguese pilots, sailors connected with the voyages of Columbus, Ottoman captains, European mapmakers, Greek geographers, Arabic-speaking scholars, copyists whose names nobody recorded, printers working in Flanders, navigators leaving London or Normandy, merchants passing through ports from Alexandria to the Western Mediterranean, thousands of people adding tiny pieces to humanity's picture of the Earth. Most are forgotten. Their knowledge is not. Perhaps a line they measured survives somewhere. Perhaps a name they used still sits on a modern map. Perhaps an error they made lasted for generations before someone corrected it. That is a different kind of immortality. Quieter than a lost civilization, more believable, and, in its own way, more moving. The room around Piri Reis grows dark once again. The Bosporus moves beyond the walls. A ship passes slowly through the night. Its crew cannot see very far ahead. They navigate by experience, stars, memory, and whatever charts they trust. Inside, the mapmaker sets down his pen. The world before him is incomplete. He knows this. There are coastlines he cannot verify. There are islands he has never seen. There are sources he must trust because no better ones exist. Still, he draws. That is perhaps the final realization hidden inside the 500-year-old map. Maps do not show only where the world is. They show where human knowledge was when the map was made. They preserve certainty. They preserve ignorance. And sometimes, if they survive long enough, they preserve mistakes so beautifully that later generations mistake them for secrets. The lamp beside the parchment flickers. Outside, water touches the dark shore. Far beyond the Mediterranean, beyond Africa, beyond the Atlantic routes of Portuguese sailors, the Antarctic wind moves across ancient ice. Piri never hears it. He never sees the white continent. He does not know that one day his name will be tied to it. He knows only the parchment before him, the fading light, the smell of ink, and the difficult coastline beneath his hand. Then the lamp goes out. The map remains. And for more than 500 years, the question waits in the dark.